Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Larry Rhodes.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. And if you do believe in God, don't be alone either. Nobody should be alone.
Nope. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free thinkers, atheists, and agnostics. This is a show for them and people curious about living a life free of supernatural
belief. It's a call-in show too, isn't it?
Yeah. But we only have one phone line, so if you can't get through, we invite you to tweet us. Send your tweets to @FFTVKnox.
Yes. And the Rationalists of East Tennessee have monthly activities, first and third Sunday mornings, usually a roundtable discussion. The second Sunday is a book club. The fourth Sunday is Reflections Gathering, which is potluck afternoon, gathering at members' homes. And you can consult that on the internet.
The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun meetup, often meeting at a bar or restaurant. Tonight's meetup will be at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria in the Old City for happy hour, food, drink, and conversation. Friday we'll meet for happy hour at the Bearden Beer Market. To find us at either one of these places, take a look around for the silver-jacketed copy of God Delusion standing upright on the table. And
today, this is June 11, and the topic we're going to talk about is religious sacrifices. What do they mean? Where's the notion come from? What's it about? We're going to try to deal with that and we'd like your contributions on this too.
First, we have an In the News segment. Atheists set up a hotline to help people losing their religion. Who can people call when religious doubts arise? Who are you going to call? You're going to call when doubts arise, but you're afraid to talk to your faith leaders or your family. A group that helps people recover from religion says that it's ready to pick up the phone. Recovering from Religion, a group which has about 40 support groups in the United States and Britain, plans to launch a hotline that will offer doubters an anonymous place to ask difficult questions and find communities of like-minded non-believers. The group plans to staff the helpline 24 hours a day and is modeling it after services like suicide prevention hotlines. Sarah Moorhead, executive director of Recovering from Religion, told CNN that the mission is to help people, not convert them to atheism. Lots of times, we just need someone to talk to, Moorhead said. The 800 number has yet to be named. Recovering from Religion is trying to raise $30,000 by June 30th to fund the hotline project with up to 40 counselors. Ideally, the helpline will be live by the holiday season, said Moorhead, which is often a difficult time for people struggling with religious doubt. The idea for the hotline sprang up after calls came in to the Recovering from Religion phone line from people who were questioning their faith and needed to talk to someone. Moorhead said that she gets a few calls every day and hundreds of emails a month from people seeking counseling. From there, she said it seems the hotline that provided a permanent anonymous place to talk to someone was the best option. Coming out as a non-believer or even as a doubter can often be extremely difficult, Moorhead and others said. In addition to the existential worries, budding non-believers run the risk of alienating families and friends. The helpline's volunteer counselors will be trained not to engage religious debate, Moorhead said, but instead they will try to give callers practical, action-oriented solutions. When someone first calls the hotline, the counselor will start simply asking the caller to talk about his or her personal story. Later, the counselor and the caller might work on an action plan. The caller's goals may concern formally leaving religion altogether, but Moorhead said that counselors will also offer advice on finding new faith or connecting with local communities of non-believers. Some blogs have questioned the hotline, however, calling it a ploy to increase the number of atheists in America. Headlines like, "The new 800 number funded by liberals to convert Christians to atheists," for example, have cropped up at a number of conservative blogs. Moorhead said her critics fail to grasp the point of recovering from religion.
Okay.
It continues, most of the people who contacted us are working their way towards disbelief, so of course they're very equipped to handle that. We are. That is not the goal, though, nor the job of the facilitators. This hotline is not completely unique in the world of religious nuns. People who either don't believe in God and don't affiliate with any religious beliefs, atheists have long discussed disbelief in the comfort of online community. We've seen how important the internet is, especially to young people questioning their faith, and this provides them another resource with a different focus, said Jesse Gallup, a communications director for the Secular Student Alliance. For people who want more guidance, I think this resource is very valuable. And I think that
we'll get into our program.
Yeah, let's go on into the program.
Okay, the question is, where do ideas like sacrifice to gods in particular, or to a god, depends on your point of view, where does this come from? And I think if you went, say, to the University of Tennessee or Maryville College or Carson Newman or one of the colleges nearby, Johnson University, I think you could get some insight into this. It starts with a kind of anthropomorphic view of the universe, and let me get into this word, anthropomorphism. All it is just the New Testament is written in Greek, and anthropomorphism just built on the Greek word anthropos, meaning man or human being. And an anthropomorphic view of the world, now we're talking about in antiquity. This is centuries ago, long before the telescope, long before what we call modern science, long before that.
Anthropomorphism means basically projecting human attributes on something that is non-human.
Yeah.
Like when you look up at the moon and you see a shape on the moon like a person's face, you can call it the man in the moon, although it's not a man. It's
there's
not
a there's a figure you pointed out to me is a rabbit.
Yeah. But if you say man in the moon is looking at me, then you're anthropomorphizing the
anthropomorphic. In fact, there's an entire book written by an anthropologist called Faces in the Clouds, in which he argues that our ancestors were highly anthropomorphic. In fact, the word spirit in both Hebrew and Greek is the same word for wind, ruach in Hebrew and in pneuma in Greek. And they both, we get pneumonia from pneuma, but they both have to do with the wind. They interpret it to be the movement of a conscious being. In fact, the whole universe, it's hard for us to imagine, and we have to work hard at it. These are people trying to make it through life with the way they had the world and their ideas at that time. And they simply thought of most of the universe as simply brought about by gods and demons and spirits, causing them to do well in their crops, or to give them rain, or to give them drought or storms.
Right. When you don't understand why something happens, it's really easy to assign it an intent by an unseen being.
Who's conscious. And then, given their point of view, it makes sense to say, well, apparently, with all the thunderstorms that aren't doing us any good, and all the floods, and all the sickness, somebody's really irritated with us.
And of course, there was a class of people that were ready to jump in there and say, I know.
Yeah,
Take advantage of that situation.
And they came up with the notion. And I think if you think of what they were doing, they were taking their own social network and seeing how things operated. And when you go to war and you're being defeated, well, maybe you could offer your enemy something in order to
propitiate.
And you have a story in the antiquity of a group that sacrificed a child, the prince, in front of the enemy's army, and then that held off the army. You see, that was a sacrifice, and often in captivity, they would take somebody, and then in captivity, then if you want to get them back, you give a ransom.
You sacrifice
money. And sacrifice money,
property,
or even a trade-off with another person. And so what these people did the best they could is they, believing these gods were angry or you had to make deals with these gods, then they gave meat offerings, they gave cereal offerings, and even child sacrifice in the hope that they could get a better deal out of life.
There was recently an item in the news, I think it was last year, where a flight crew, a mechanic crew on a plane, a ground-based plane, said that they actually sacrificed a goat so that the plane would work better. You know, you have to wonder about
that's
their maintenance schedule. You know, they were sacrificing a goat.
Wonder about the mechanics. I'd rather have a good mechanic. And that's where the phrase "got your goat" came from, maybe. I don't know.
A scapegoat, for sure.
Scapegoat, certainly. And what a scapegoat was is rather than sacrifice your son or your daughter, you give a goat. And that's bargaining.
But you could pile all of your sins on the goat and then drive it out into the desert, and it would take your sins with it.
And that's literally in the Old Testament. That is what's a scapegoat means. So all of this, there's a story in the Bible, the book of Jonah, for example. You had these, what the Hebrews would call the Gentiles or the pagans, the heathen. They had Jonah on the ship. And Jonah got on the ship, but the ship was in a storm. Well, given their anthropomorphic outlook, apparently this was a very severe storm, and they thought the gods were angry with them. And if you remember in the story, they tossed Jonah overboard, thinking that would make the gods happy. And especially since he was a foreigner, they were quite willing to do that. It was a better deal for them, and it would be sufficient for the gods.
There was a story I heard about back in the day when the sailors were very superstitious and had to appease the gods, you know, for certain things. Whenever a major storm would come up, they would look around the ship for a person who was causing the problem for the god, and like Jonah, they would throw him over or something. Yeah. So they approached this guy and said, you know, you're the problem. And he swept his arm around on all the other ships out there. He says, what do you think's going on in every one of those ships? I mean, this storm is going to affect all of them. Did I cause all that? We have a call.
Okay, let's go.
Welcome to Freethought Forum. May we have a name or a nickname, please?
My name's Lee.
Go ahead, Lee.
Okay, welcome to Freethought Forum. Do you have a comment or question?
I do. I've got a comment. If they think I had an uncle that didn't believe in God until he come to die, he started to die, and then he started hollering, "Oh God, help me!" And if they don't believe you, if they think they don't believe in God, just wait till they come to die.
You're talking about they, you mean us?
I'm talking about the people on television right now.
Well, okay. I know what you're talking about. These are called death. These are called deathbed repentances. And okay, I get your point. It's a nice threat.
Yeah.
I think
it's a nice story too. They also said that about Darwin, but his sister told the true story after his aunt published it in the Baptist paper that he recanted on his deathbed. It was just an anecdotal story until his sister got a hold of the press and told the true story about it.
Yeah.
Now the thing about it is, even if he did, do you think that a person on his last legs and last gasping breath is like a drowning man? He wouldn't grasp at certain straws, and his mental facilities are degrading quickly as well. So he may very well have regressed back to his childhood.
The lady has a point. Some people are frightened when they die. I think that's your point. And so you take out the best insurance policy you think is available. Now, if you're a Muslim, you'll take out a different policy.
Right.
That's right.
And if you're a Hindu, you'll take another policy.
Right.
And if you're a Christian, and if you're a Church of Christ, most of the Baptists and Unitarians, Episcopalians are not going to make it anyhow. So my question is, let me ask you, Lee. How many people do you think, what percentage of the human race, now think with me, and don't duck the question, if you can. I mean, it's not an easy question.
Well, give him a chance.
Go ahead.
No,
What's the percentage of people you think will, if they died right now, just died without any deathbed repentances, would go to hell?
All over the world?
Around the world. All the Hindus and those that are not Christian. What are the percentage of the human race that would go to hell, do you think?
Would go to hell?
Uh-huh.
Anybody that's not a Christian.
So what a percentage would you think that would be?
I have no idea, sir.
That'd be about 2/3 of the world.
At least 2/3 of the human race. Okay. Okay, well, thank you.
But I'm going to tell you one thing. Are you there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
If you think there's no God, you wait till you get ready to die. Wait till you come to die.
Okay.
Well, okay, here's one thing. Let's assume there is a God, okay? What you call God, if you believe in hell and most of the people going there, I wouldn't call that God. I would call you an atheist of type B. The reason I'm saying that, a God is going to be worthy of the name, has got to have some moral character. But the evangelical and the fundamentalist God doesn't have enough moral character to measure up. He's kind of a cosmic Nazi. So in that sense, any being that's going to send most of the human race to eternal damnation, you couldn't trust because he doesn't have any morals.
Even Mark Twain called him a malign thug.
Yeah, it's not something you'd want to call God. It's something, it's kind of pathetic in a way that people would.
Right.
But anyhow, it's good to have people differing because it helps people to formulate their views and maybe straighten out certain areas that we all have. I mean, we're all just human. And now, another interesting question is, why is it that in the Old Testament, where some people get their notion of God, he did not want pork on the altar, just beef and lamb and maybe some pigeons. But why not pork? Now, did God have a cholesterol problem? Well, no. When I was a kid, I was born during the Depression. And so I couldn't help. I was in the Baptist church, and I had good people working with me. You know, in fact, I talked to one of my Sunday school teachers the other day, and she's about 93, a very dear friend of mine, and we keep in good touch. But when I was living right after the Depression, I was born right in the middle of it. I kept hearing the preacher talk about the sacrifices made on the altars in the Old Testament. Now, he didn't talk about the Greeks making their sacrifices with their gods, and around the world, other sacrifices. But I kept wondering when I was a kid, who ate the meat? Now, when you're born during the Depression, you think of things like that, you know. That meat, and one passage the Bible talks about just burning up the meat, but there are other passages talked about the priest eating it, and there's one passage that says that the male priests should eat it, which sort of implies they're female priests. It does. But you can bet your bottom dollar it was the male priest who came up with that rule, that the male priest would get the food.
Let's talk about some of these other societies that have been sacrificing. You talked about Aztecs and Incas. We have a slide for that. The Aztecs would sacrifice to the sun god. Is that correct?
Well, there are different versions of that, but they had their gods who really wanted even human sacrifice.
Yes.
Again, there's an example of a God with no morals.
Right.
I mean, now, I don't think that God existed, but my point is they conceived of a God with no morals. Right. Now, take the story in the Old Testament of Abraham believing that the creator of the universe, now think about it, the creator of the universe wanted, he believed, his son, Isaac, to be sacrificed on an altar. And he was prepared to do it. Now, that's what bothered me when I read that, is that a guy would interpret that to be the voice of God in the first place, and then be so perverse as to actually be willing to slaughter his own son, and then later people claiming that showed how much faith he had. Today, if someone did this today, they would say either he was insane or a pervert.
Right. Well, they do it today. People do sacrifice or at least kill their own children in the name of God. And my question to them was, how do you know it's God? Why couldn't it have been Satan telling you to do something like that? If you believe that your God is all good and all knowing and would not do anything to hurt us, then why would you think that he'd want you to kill somebody?
Okay, now in the New Testament, you had sensible people trying to wrestle with this problem. And so in one of the pastoral epistles in the New Testament, it says, test the spirits. Or the King James translation is prove the spirits. Mm-hmm. But that's the Elizabethan English. And it really means test the spirits. Well, how do you test them? Well, what I'm suggesting, if it's a moral deity, see, I don't worry about whether people believe in a God or not. That's not my big problem. My problem, if you believe in a God, is this God moral or not? And these Christians were trying to work out the problem of how in the world do you handle this notion of God sacrificing. And as I mentioned on the program before, in the story of Jonah, when you think about this, 8 people were saved, and the rest of the human race, along with animals, mm-hmm. and that includes the children. All these people who complained about abortion,
infants,
ought to read that story in the book of Genesis, drowned all those children. Now, can you see Noah in the ark, watching all those little children floating by and all their mothers, and they drown? Now, according to the evangelical view, those mothers and fathers were all wicked and therefore deserved to go to hell, and the children would go to heaven, and they won't be with their parents. Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm suggesting is this is an insane view of the universe.
Well, the thing about it is, why did he flood the earth and kill all the people?
Well, he borrowed a story. This borrows from another story.
It was theoretically to rid the world of evil.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Evil's still with us. Would you say that he failed then? Just another one of God's failures in the Bible?
In the Old Testament, you have a problem of the character of God as to whether or not he knows everything. And you got Elohim is one Hebrew word for God. Mm-hmm. By the way, the word Elohim is plural mm-hmm. for El. Right. And then you got Yahweh, you got Adonai, and all of these different versions of God. They're trying, the early Hebrews, you got to give them credit. They're trying to work out all of this that they inherited. We got another caller.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Our caller,
You're on the line, on the air.
Jeffrey here. How you doing? Do you remember me from last week?
Yes. How are you, Jeffrey? Welcome back.
Yeah, I was trying to say that we tried to sacrifice a virgin last week in the name of atheism here in Southern Ontario, but we couldn't find one. Son of a gun.
That's the way.
Actually, in the Old Testament, the sacrifice, the ban on eating pork and eating shellfish and not putting milk with pork actually made good common sense back then before the invention of refrigeration, when salt was the same price as gold by weight. That actually made good sense to avoid pork.
When you see people eating things and then dying or getting sick, then it pretty much puts that on the bad list.
Yeah, an alternative theory to that, I mean, this is a good theory too. Mm-hmm. An alternative theory is that if you have nomads who herd sheep and goat, and you cannot herd pigs. Anybody who's ever tried it, just you know you can't do it. And so they didn't have pigs. And so they assumed their God would want whatever they have to offer. And if they have other cultures over there with pigs, well, that's another tribe.
Well, this was the beginning of agrarian society, and there were pigs in cities that people kept in cities. Remember Jesus put the spirits into the pigs. So.
Oh, well, that's way later. I mean, that's centuries later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the disease is, but if you don't salt pork or refrigerate pork properly, you're going to have some serious problems.
Trichinosis, I think?
They wouldn't have known what the problems were. They just would have decided that don't eat pork. It's a better idea than to make it God's order while you're at it.
That's true.
If you had priests writing those rules down, then it was all of a sudden from God.
Well, that's a very, I think, a useful theory. If you cook pork, it's okay, but you got to really cook it. And if you're short on coals, then beef. But I don't think pigs were just available to those nomads.
And talking about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I think probably it works both
Wandering
ways
tribes.
if you think about it.
Yeah,
If you think about shellfish, you're trying to transport shellfish across the desert for some nomadic tribe to eat. It's going to be pretty bad.
Yeah, well, really
bad.
Nomads don't get much shellfish in the desert anyhow.
Yeah.
And it makes more sense to simply not eat it.
Yeah.
The other provision from, Leviticus, Deuteronomy? Do not put the dairy products with meat. Now, milk and cheese, that would sour real fast, and it could turn your really good meat into really bad meat.
Well, it does say don't eat two kinds of grains together. Don't wear two kinds of clothes together. I think they just took this to extreme. When the priest got a hold of it.
Oh yeah, very much too extreme. I mean, it does make sense on the surface. We're talking 3,000 years ago, not today.
So your view on circumcision would be a health reason. Is that what you're saying?
My view on circumcision, I didn't know I was going to get one, but yeah, that comes from Africa northbound.
Mm-hmm.
It actually started in Central Africa among black Negro tribes, as you wish. Yeah, that makes good sense there in a jungle, lots of insects. Yes, it makes good sense there, but it doesn't really make sense in the Middle East. I think it was just a custom they picked up and held on to now for 3,000 years and counting.
Here's a book on this by an anthropologist. Contends, and here's another theory, is that they were concerned about seed. And in those days, a male seed was thought to be simply little children. And so just as you prune trees to make them produce better, her view is they pruned the male organ in order to produce more seed. And that's one theory. There are many theories going on, but that's what's interesting to me is you have all these human beings with these different theories, and then you have an elaborate system that priests invent, thinking this is what God wanted, is circumcision. Okay. Now, one theory would be that circumcision, if people ran around in the Middle East in a warm climate with no clothes on, it would be a tribal mark. So instead of cutting your face, you cut another part of your organ, and that would distinguish you from some other tribe. And so to be uncircumcised would be somebody who's not in your tribe.
Now, how did you say you found the show? You called in last week and you said you found it because you heard of somebody talking about it?
Well, a man named Lee Erickson was doing an interview on the Pink Atheist. That's the first time I heard about your show.
Right, and you're in Ontario now, right?
Right, just outside of Toronto.
Okay.
Hey, I got me as a regular viewer. By the way, I checked the videotape from last week's show. It's a higher number than average checking on your YouTube videos. So either I brought along an audience or I was interesting.
Well, thank you.
On YouTube, that's cool.
Well, I'm glad you brought this out. Here's another book that some of you might be interested in called Dying for the Gods. The early Hebrews were not the only ones who held this notion of sacrificing. The Greeks, and in fact, you can find it probably around the world, and I think a better explanation is the anthropomorphic view. If you think the gods are conscious beings and get angry or can do you favors, then you give them the best you got. And I think child sacrifice grew out of that because the child is the dearest thing to you. And in the story of Abraham, he was prepared apparently to sacrifice Isaac. Now in the story, you have Abraham getting a revelation that that's not what God wanted in the first place, which is, I think, not a revelation from heaven. I think this is simply a moral development within the culture, and my guess is it came from the women who brought these children in the world and helped raise them. And in the story of Abraham, you don't find a case in which Abraham tells Sarah, his wife, he's going off to murder her son. Can you imagine what she would say?
Oh yeah, she would have been up one side of his face and down the other.
Yeah. You're going to do what?
You're going to do what with my boy? Yeah. You can't do that with my boy. Honest.
Now so anthropologists are looking into this different kinds of religions around the world and finding that this anthropomorphic model seems. You find a passage, for example, in 2 Samuel, in which Saul, the king, is missing Samuel, the prophet.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Samuel is dead. So he goes to a medium to try to get him resurrected. And he believes that this being comes back. And he uses the word Elohim, which is the translation is spirit. Some of the translations calls it spirit. But the word is Elohim, and it's the same word in the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God, Elohim, created the universe. So what I'm suggesting is that the notion of spirits in the dreams, this is where notions of gods came about among ancient people.
I believe it.
That when these dreams are vivid, I don't know about you, but my dreams are vivid.
Especially when they've lost somebody recently.
Yeah, that's dear to them.
And then they dream of them. Mm-hmm. They think that they've come back to visit them during the night. That can be very powerful. Thank you for your call. We're going to go on to break now. This is, in case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contributions. Shows are live most every Tuesday from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock Eastern Time on community access television. You can also see it streaming online outside the Knoxville area by going to ctvknox.org. Okay,
it's a call-in show, and we are live.
June 11th.
And viewers can call in now on the numbers on the screen, or you can tweet us at FTV Knox.
Right.
And I'm very pleased to hear from Canada.
Yeah.
And also from this lady who came from local. I thought that was very useful to us.
The Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets 2 times a week. We have meetups for fun, drink, conversation. The purpose of ASK is to supply a venue for community, camaraderie, and outreach to atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, and other like-minded persons in the East Tennessee area.
Okay, the Rationalists of East Tennessee has Sunday activities involving lively presentations and discussions of interesting topics that are timeless, and have a monthly book club. And you don't have to read the book for the discussion. And go ahead.
We've got a couple of information videos we'd like to show you. They're short, to the point. Would you like to go ahead and roll?
If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
And we're back. Joe, you had a theory you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I'd like to try this theory and see what you think. Whenever you think about a God and you say, well, now, what does a God need? Does he need goat meat? Well, as the Hebrews developed their theory of God, they realized God doesn't have a stomach, probably doesn't have adenoids, And so you have a passage in the Bible, God is spirit. Okay, well that does away pretty much of the organs of the body. And so even the notion of God smelling the odor, that's in the Old Testament, that pretty much disappears. And so by the time before the Apostle Paul, you had various rabbis developing the notion that what God was really interested in was prayer, not sacrifice. But before that, in the Old Testament, you had Micah the prophet saying bluntly that God's not interested in all of this meat. And he's interested in mercy and humility and justice and that sort of thing.
Praise.
Yeah. Well, most of us like praise, but then I think a lot of this praise in the Middle East came from those kings who had to be praised all the time. It occurred to me once as a kid, the Lord God of the universe, does he need all this praise? My father, who was a good man, he didn't need a lot of praise. What he did need from me is to behave myself and make something, he used to say, make something of yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what a father would really want, or a mother.
Want you to be independent.
Yeah, and I'm a father, and I wouldn't want my kids going around praising me all the time. I think the best praise, if you put it this way, is they live a good, decent life and earn their own way, you know, and help others. And I think these rabbis began to put this together and realize their view of God was pretty antiquated. And so they came up with, now by the time you get to the Apostle Paul, the Hebrews were living in towns and cities, and they weren't nomads anymore, herding sheep and goats and cows. And so getting sheep, cows, and goats to make sacrifices, and that gets to be pretty expensive. So you get a temple now, but you don't, in other words, you just have a few of them. But what the Apostle Paul came up with, and I think some of the early Christians, was there was a sacrifice made, and that's the end of it. That put it all to end.
Talking about Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. Now what was interesting, there's a forerunner among these early Hebrews were working through this. And in the Maccabean period, which is about 164 BC, you had 800, I believe, I'd have to look it up again, Jews who were crucified, okay? Mm-hmm. Because of their religion and because of their culture. Now, there was a theory developed that this would count as a kind of atonement. Well, see, the idea was already there among the Hebrews, you see, and it's moving away from animal sacrifice. Now you can see how animal sacrifice developed. If you've got a son or a daughter, you'd rather convince the God that a sheep would be a better deal for him. It's certainly be a better deal for you.
Right.
But here's what the Apostle Paul did, it seemed to me, and others, simply saying, there was a Jesus. That's the Greek word. It's just the Greek word for Joshua, who died. And he could have been among those others, you see. But anyhow, he counts as the final death, blood sacrifice, and that wipes it out. And by the time you get to the Epistle to the Hebrews, you see that he's the high priest. You don't need a priesthood anymore. If you read the New Testament, there is no priesthood except every believer, according to one of the epistles of Peter, every believer is a priest. But they don't go around sacrificing meat because that whole system is simply wiped out. And it was being wiped out gradually by the rabbis. And keep in mind, the Apostle Paul himself had been a Pharisee. That's a rabbi in that tradition. And the rabbis then were the liberals. Now, the New Testament gives the Pharisees a bad rap, but they were the more liberal, developed.
I'm sure there were some conservatives among them, and they may have formed a clique that would have not liked to see the change happen.
Well, they were called Sadducees because the Sadducees had the temple, and the temple people, the Sadducees, had the sacrifices. They also were in with the Roman government and the Greek government, So they had a good political setup. The Pharisees, in effect, were saying, you don't need that system, you need an education system. And you see a major paradigm shift in the Hebrew tradition, and the Christian tradition is another paradigm shift.
Well, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, never really thought of Jesus as being alive in his time. He saw him as a spirit.
Well, that's a big debate as to what Paul really thought there had been a historical Jesus. There's no question about that. But you can't, I don't think you can nail down, if you read the epistles themselves, you cannot nail down as to when he thought Jesus existed particularly. Now, the tradition says that he existed about 30 years before Paul, or maybe a little bit before, depends on where you, so you can't really for sure date when you think Jesus was born precisely. Maybe 5 BC.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the point of the sacrifice itself. You would think that an omniscient, all-powerful God who had his son, basically himself, on earth and loved him as much as any father would love a son, would find some other way to appease his own anger for the original sin and all the sins of humans. Well, you asked than kill his son.
You asked the question before we started on the program: who gets all of this sacrifice and who wants it? And in the Old Testament, seemingly God wants it. But that raises the moral question: is this the kind of being that is worth the worship? The word worship means worthship. Is this the kind of worthy being who demands that executing somebody so he can start forgiving? Now, you can say there are Middle East tyrants long before this time who wanted that kind of thing, but that's why they were tyrants. They were human beings.
And theoretically, God would have been somebody way above human failings.
Unfortunately, they projected their own feelings onto their God.
Their deity.
And then gradually, as their morality changed, then their view of God changed. And I think that's what's happening here is people are getting more moral. And I'm convinced, I mean, just think of the male ego in the Hebrew Bible. Moses, all of these are males, male priests.
Patriarchy.
But look at where ethics really develops among children. It's usually with the mothers. But they didn't pay attention very much to mothers. And I think this is a major flaw in that tradition. I mean, where's the golden rule come from? It's from their mothers.
I mean, the religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all patriarchal in nature. And,
now, right now, Judaism and Christianity is trying to work out of that. I mean, let's be fair. They're trying to work out of it.
I always like to say that the better Christians, the better Jews, the better people of those societies are better because of how far they have left their religion behind. The ones who adhere more closely to the religions are showing the old...
Here's where you and I differ. All groups have denominational differences. I don't think by just becoming an atheist you're going to be a better person.
No.
And look at Stalin.
I agree. But what I'm saying is, as they move away from them, their morals are not grounded in the Old Testament, the old ways of doing things, and they can develop new, more humane ones. It's not a guarantee that they will.
Okay.
But it's a chance for them to do that.
What if you did this? What you see as moral improvement in any religion, or among atheists too, is human beings working out a better ethics and then projecting it onto their system.
Right, but they're not allowed to, they have no ability to change the words in the book is the problem. It's not something that they can go back, they can reinterpret them, but the words remain the same, and new generations can come up and be poisoned by those words.
Well, you got a good point. You're stuck with a book. But, try this. You're stuck with Greek literature. You don't throw it out.
Those aren't the words of God.
Okay.
I mean, in our society.
But at that point, many of the Greeks thought these were the words of God. See, what I'm trying to say, and maybe you disagree with me on this, let's see, is by studying these people, trying to work through their problems in their environment, we learn something about ourselves. For example, when I talk to some atheists, I see them just like some Christians I know. You follow what I'm saying?
Sure. Opinionated?
Yeah. Well, all of us are opinionated. Dogmatic, yeah. And that's true because I'm a human being. And my wife has a way of saying, and when her eyebrow goes up, I know that I've overstepped my case. And then it's time for me to back off and start being sensible. And I'm saying that just because people are theists, that doesn't mean they haven't worked through these things morally and they've come up with great insights that people who are atheists have borrowed also. In other words, we learn from each other.
Well, sure.
So I don't want to get in a position to say, now, if you convert over to my view, then I don't think you're saying.
All we're trying to do is get people to think about their beliefs a little bit.
Yeah.
Even the atheists. Atheist just means you don't believe in God, but you can have other beliefs as well. And it works to your benefit if you consider those beliefs and be objective about it and not totally subjective. But religion tends to tie you to the words in the book. And I mean, that's basically what religion is.
Okay, I talk to people who teach, say, the Old Testament, and I find their ethics is what I'd call humanism. Mm-hmm. I find many atheists are humanists. Mm-hmm. And when I talk, I can't tell the difference in terms of between an atheist and a theist. And when I talked about this. When I go to fly on a plane, I don't say, "Are you a Baptist or Methodist?" I want to know.
A good pilot.
Yeah. And if he's a good Baptist pilot, I'm just glad he's good at it. Or she. Pardon my chauvinism.
Yeah. Reminder: this is a call-in show. We've got about 12 minutes left in the show, and we welcome your calls. The number's at the bottom of the screen. You can talk about the topic that we have at the bottom or on the screen, or you can talk about any other topic you like.
Let's try another thing with some of the early Christians after the New Testament were trying to solve the question: how does Jesus' death become an atonement? Some of the very early Christians after the New Testament actually thought that the death of Jesus was a sacrifice to the devil. How do they come up with that? Well, I think you can see they were raising the question at that time that you and I are raising here. I mean, this is almost 2,000 years ago. They were saying, does God really want the death of his own son?
And himself, if you consider it.
Yeah, if you got the Trinity notion. And so they said, well, it was really the devil. And then, keeping in mind, they had the Trojan horse story already existing. It was a very popular story. Mm-hmm. And some of the early Christians seemed to think, and part of it hinting in the New Testament, that Jesus came just as a lowly peasant, and the devil pounced on him, and that was the power of God opening up. You see?
I hadn't heard that.
Well, what that means is that the devil got taken in. Jesus was the Trojan horse, you follow me? And as soon as he got murdered, it's like opening up the belly of that Trojan horse, and all the soldiers marched out. And so in the death of Jesus, as they perceived it, I mean, this is a new mythology, but you can see a morality developing. In the death of this person, a new morality develops.
Well, how would you address the fact that Christians really don't believe that Jesus, or anybody for that matter, can literally die, because you live forever in heaven? And Jesus, as being a part of the Trinity, would have known that he was only going to be dead for a few days and then end up being at the right hand of himself in heaven. So how much of a sacrifice was it when he died for a few days and actually went up to heaven, and he knew about it beforehand?
Well, that's such a good question, and let me deal with it a little bit.
Sure.
In the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, you have Jesus being tempted. In fact, you have Jesus in Luke, when he's 12, he's learning something, as if he didn't know anything. He increases in wisdom and in stature in favor of God and man, which he presupposes he didn't know everything.
Yeah.
Now, here you have notion of Jesus as a human being who apparently can have human emotions and temptations, you see. Now, your question is, how can God be tempted if he knows everything in the first place, which is a sensible question.
And who did he talk to in the Garden of Gethsemane?
Okay, well, by the time you get to the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, he simply eliminates the temptations because he is making Jesus fully God in flesh. The other gospels are kind of, they don't use the word theos to refer to Jesus. They use kurios, which is a word used for, as even C.S. Lewis says, that can mean anywhere from Mr. to God. And it's kurios is used to refer to, which means, one translation is Lord, refers to Caesar. So I think what they're trying to do is develop a new system that did away with Caesar, who was a god. Yeah, are you with me? Mm-hmm. And this was they needed a new way to get a new world view within their anthropomorphic outlook.
Sure.
So you give them credit. This was a moral development, borrowing from, taking the moral strains already in the New Testament, putting them together. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, parts of the New Testament keeps the most vicious parts of the Old Testament and makes it even worse, and that's the book of Revelation.
And even Jesus said that not one jot or tittle of the old book will pass away before all is fulfilled. So you got to include the Old Testament in all of the new. They keep referring to the people in the Old Testament. So they can't change the words in the Old Testament. So they come up with a New Testament to modify them, to alleviate some of the strictures of it. And then Islam comes along, 1,400 years later, and tries to make it even more so. But then it turns out that it's even more barbaric.
Well, take polygamy.
Than the Old Testament.
Yeah. So in the Old Testament, polygamy seemed to be, there's Abraham, who is even in the New Testament, is the model of faith. He's a polygamist, at least a bigamist. Mm-hmm. And David is, now, is this moral relativism in the Old Testament that God approved? And then by the time you get to the New Testament, a bishop's got to be at least husband of one wife. And it seemingly by the time you get to the New Testament, cultures have changed. Monogamy has taken place, and so they get a revelation. Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm suggesting is all of these revelations are really the culture projecting this onto the deities.
So if you had to sum it up, what would you tell the fundamentalist who is trying to live the Old Testament as it exists today, or even the New?
Well, in other words, to do what common sense tells you. I just came off of a freeway here onto the James Parkway. As soon as I hit the bumping on the road, it told me to slow down. And there are parts in the Bible that morally tells you to slow down. Don't just swallow it. Some of it is
Can you name some of those?
Well, I can give you the book of Revelation, which
the
is...
whole book?
Yeah, well, no. The book of Revelation is basically a human book that has hostility toward outsiders and love toward insiders. And it is incredible love and incredible hostility. And what we're saying is that passage in the New Testament says, love your enemies. You don't find a lot of that in the book of Revelation. So what I'm suggesting is many Christians do what all of us do. You pick the parts of the culture that make more sense and are moral. And you put that, you say, this is our ideals, and the rest you put aside. Yeah. And a lot of Christians do that, and that's why...
But that's the point I was making, If you do that, then you're leaving the better part of it, a lot of it behind. You're distancing yourself from the strict teachings of the laws of the Old Testament.
Exactly.
And some of the New.
And they know that.
And the more you do that, the more that you can develop your own humanity, your own compassion and love for your fellow man, because you won't have to be bound by the strictures of the Old Testament.
Try this. Keep the Old Testament, because that's not a revelation of a God. That's a revelation of how human beings operate and learn from
what they believed at the time.
Yeah, and that's how you and I operate today, and we make the same kinds of mistakes. We have different language. but we also do the same kinds of things. So when we read the Old Testament, you say, yeah, that sounds like me. I better back off because that's
you want the same results.
That's a mirror. Yeah. And so what I admire about the Old Testament is they keep the Nixon tapes. You know, they don't cheat. I mean, when they tell the story of David,
it's a timepiece.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah,
it's like if you see an old 20s movie, you're not going to think of all the problems with the movie because they're not using modern communication devices. You look at it as a picture of the way people lived back then, what they thought and how they believed. And that's how the Old Testament, I think, should be viewed.
That's a good way to put it.
But when you take it literally as a way to live in the 20th century, 21st century, then you're making a major mistake.
Yeah.
And you can lose family and friends over it.
Yeah, you can learn from
and your own humanity.
Would you say you can learn from it without deifying it?
Right.
Yeah, and it's a great text to learn from. It's a rich text,
of course,
but don't deify it.
So is the Odyssey.
The Odyssey,
Homer's works, all the Old Testament.
The Iliad,
The Iliad. Can be used for enlightenment.
And that's why they teach them.
Human condition.
That's why they teach them in literature courses. It's not because it's a divine revelation. It's a revelation about how human beings try to operate in a world that they discover.
I wouldn't mind. I mean, I have no objection to teaching the Bible in school now, as long as you teach it as literature and not as pushing it forward as truth. You know, with a capital T.
Yeah, I would be quite content if they had different views and discuss them.
And
but I think some of the preachers who want the Bible in the public schools want not just the Bible, but their particular version of interpretation
of it.
And that's each preacher becomes his own pope.
You know, well, when you get right down to it, every person in the pew becomes their own church, as we were saying earlier, and have their own interpretation of the scriptures and their own.
And that's why it's important for them to talk to each other. I mean, it's good for me to talk to somebody who differs with me. I like what Billy Graham's wife said.
What'd she say?
I wish Billy had listened to her more.
Yeah.
Said if a husband and wife agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary. I love what my wife said. Which one of you is unnecessary? So, but I think Billy Graham's wife had a very good point. Is a marriage or friendship has to have some disagreement. I disagree with a lot of what I believed, and I'm sure I'm going to be changing my mind, and that's that's because I'm a fallible human being, not infallible.
You accept the fact that you are fallible and you can learn and become a better person, or at least more knowledgeable as you go down the road.
Well, we about run out of time, or
we're
we got
getting pretty close. Got about 1:20.
Oh well, okay. Well, we better do the
Okay.
And then go ahead.
Did you have another book that you'd like to?
Well, let's see. I had this one is by an anthropologist that you can tell I've kind of worn it out. The Ghost Dance by Weston LeBar.
The Ghost Dance?
Yeah, it's about some of the American natives. I won't go into the story, but it borrows from there, and then he moves on for that to discuss other religions. But it's I met him once over in Duke University. I just happened to be over there, and I just looked him up. And
what was his name?
Weston LeBar.
Okay.
In fact, he was about 80-something when I met him, and that was 20 years ago or more. So really? he's probably dead by now.
Okay. It's get out your pen and paper. We're time to start wrapping up. This has been a Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville on the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
Please send us, am I on the right page here?
Yeah.
The feedback. Leaving a voicemail at 865-272-9060. Let me repeat that again.
272-9060. And remember, examine your